The night she overheard him, Maris was not meant to be in the library at all. She had come for the household accounts, 3 ledgers the steward had mislaid, which she had located herself, tucked behind the atlases where no one but a woman who catalogued for pleasure would think to look. And she had stepped inside on a candle's worth of courage, because the library was technically his room's anteroom, and she had not yet decided whether her presence in this house permitted such liberties. She had not yet decided much about her presence in this house. She had been its mistress for 11 days, and in those 11 days the Duke of Crestwall had spoken to her perhaps 40 words, all of them pertaining to schedules. She was not yet certain he knew her given name. She knew something more about him after the next 3 minutes than she had learned in 11 days of marriage. The voices came from the inner room, its door ajar, and she would have retreated at once. She was by habit and necessity a woman who retreated, except that her own name stopped her foot mid-step with the force of a hand laid flat against her chest. Not her given name, her father's name. Westholt, spoken in her husband's voice, that low, controlled voice that never rose and never needed to. She did not move. She would not have been able to say, afterward, that she had chosen to stay. The body has its own decisions. She could not see into the room. She did not need to. She had been reading rooms her whole life through walls and closed doors, through the shape of silences and the rhythm of breath, a skill her father had called uncanny, and her mother's relations had called worse things. She heard 2 voices, her husband's and a woman's, cultured, low, faintly amused in the manner of people who have found amusement to be the safest face to wear. She heard the clink of glass on a tray, she heard the fire shift, and she heard the Duke of Crestwall say, quite plainly, in the voice he used to discuss the potato harvest, "I married her for the land." The entail required it. Once the transfer is executed, she may go wherever she likes. A pause. Then the woman's voice, and under the amusement there was something else, something Maris filed and did not yet name. And when will the transfer be executed? A fortnight. Aldrich has the documents ready. She need only sign. Maris set the ledgers down on the nearest shelf, very quietly, the way a woman sets down something she does not intend to pick up again, and she left the library. She did not know then that the thing she had just overheard was not the truth. She did not know that the documents her husband's steward had ready were not what her husband believed them to be. She did not know that the woman in that room had been planning for longer than the marriage had existed, and that the plan required her signature and her absence in that order. She would learn all of it. But not tonight. Tonight she had a fortnight, and she had a title she had not asked for, and she had a decision to make. Had she known what it would cost her, she would have made it the same way. That was simply the kind of woman she was. The deadline was real. She counted it as she walked back to her rooms, 14 days to the spring quarter session, at which point the Westholt parcel, 700 acres of chalk downland, 2 tenant farms, a fish pond, and the ruins of a tower her grandfather had built and her father had loved, and her mother had sold twice over in theory before dying insolvent, would pass to the Crestwall entail, or to wherever those documents actually directed it. 14 days was enough. She had worked with less. She set her own candle on her desk, opened the first of the retrieved ledgers, and began to read. The Duke of Crestwall's household accounts were a revelation, and not a flattering one. Not because they were falsified, she could not yet say that, but because they were a particular kind of orderly that she had learned, in her years of keeping her father's books and then her father's creditors at bay, to distrust entirely. They were the accounts of a man who had not looked at them himself in some time. The totals agreed. The categories were consistent. And here and there, in the spacing between entries, there was the faint, systematic regularity of a hand that was writing what it intended to be found, not what had actually occurred. She recognized the technique because she had once, at 17, maintained a parallel set of books for a cousin who was stealing from his own estate, and she had been the one to catch him, and he had never forgiven her. She marked 3 entries in pencil, very lightly, and closed the ledger. Then she sat for a while and looked at the wall. She had married a man who had married her for a piece of land. She had not been deceived about this. Her father's brother had been plain about the terms, and she had accepted them because the alternative was another year in her uncle's house being useful and overlooked and counting other people's silver. She had expected a cold arrangement. She had not expected to mind it. She had been wrong about that, which was information she filed alongside the 3 penciled ledger entries, without sentiment. Maris Westholt, Maris Crestwall, she supposed, though she had not yet decided to accept that, had never been able to afford sentiment. Sentiment was a luxury of people who could retreat when the accounting went wrong. She could not retreat. The land was hers. Or it had been. And she had 11 days of legal standing in this house, and she intended to use them. She went to bed. She slept, because she was practical. The candle burned down without her. She met the steward Aldrich Pembrose for the first time the following morning. Though she had of course seen him at the wedding, she had seen everything at the wedding, cataloging the room with the slightly desperate attention of a woman who knows she will not be given a second chance to take stock. Pembrose was perhaps 45, beautifully dressed in the manner of a man who has decided that precision of appearance is a form of authority, with a way of going still when he was thinking that another observer might have read as composure. She read it as calculation. The difference was small but mattered. He brought the household papers to her sitting room at 10 o'clock, which was not something she had requested. He presented this as a courtesy. His Grace thought you might wish to familiarize yourself with the household's operations. The voice was mild. The eyes were not, quite. They did the thing eyes do when they are measuring how much you already know. How thoughtful. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit, please, I have some questions about the Martinmas entries. The stillness. The Martinmas entries are straightforward. I am certain they are. Sit, please. She opened the ledger to the marked page. Walk me through the purchase of the winter stores. I want to understand how the house manages bulk ordering. He sat. He walked her through the entries. He was very good. The explanations were smooth, internally consistent, and delivered with a faint paternalism that she recognized as a technique for making people feel foolish if they pursued the matter further. She pursued the matter further. She asked about suppliers and contracts and delivery dates and the names of the men who signed for the goods received. She did not write anything down during this conversation. She had no need to. She had a memory that her mother's family had called a gift from God, and her father's family had called an affliction, and either way, it was hers. Pembrose left after 40 minutes looking exactly as composed as when he had arrived. She watched his back go through the door and noted the single thing that had changed. The set of his shoulders, which were a degree tighter than they had been when he sat down. A small adjustment, the sort a man makes when he has reevaluated a variable he had dismissed. She was glad to have been dismissed. People who were watching you were much harder to work around than people who thought they were watching you. She found the Duke in the stable yard just before noon, not because she had sought him out, but because she had gone to look at the horses. She had been raised near horses, could read a horse's mood the way she read a room, and the Crestwall stables had been mentioned in the settlement as one of the things she was technically mistress of, and he was there before her. He had his coat off and was examining the near foreleg of a bay gelding with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who is thinking about the animal and nothing else. His hands were working hands. She noticed, because she noticed everything, that his hands did not look like a duke's hands. There was a rope callus on his right palm, and his knuckles were weathered in a way that meant he did this sort of work regularly, not for show. He became aware of her at the same moment she decided to stop watching him. There was a beat, the kind that happens when two people have both been caught at something, and then he straightened. Lady Crestwall. The title sat strangely in his mouth, she thought, as though it belonged to a different conversation. Your Grace. She nodded toward the gelding. The left fore? A pause. He had not expected that. Yes, he favors it. He's been shod too tight. You can see it in the way he shifted when you touched the coronet. He anticipated the pressure. If you bring the shoe up 1/4 of an inch, she stopped. She was doing the thing she did, the thing that had made her father's grooms first baffled and then loyal, which was thinking aloud in spaces where thinking aloud was not invited. I beg your pardon. That was unsolicited. He looked at her. She was not sure she had been looked at, truly, since the wedding, and the attention was not comfortable. He had the quality, she had noticed, of a man who did not look unless he was looking at something, and who, once he was looking, did not blink away from what he found. His face was not unkind, it was simply armored, the way faces go when they have been hurt in a specific place long enough that the armor has become the face. It is your stable, he said at last. It is your horse. He turned back to the gelding, which shifted and then settled under his hand. The groom's name is Pell. Tell him I said to re-examine the shoe. She did not stay. She delivered the message to Pell, who received it with the expression of a man who has been told something he already knew by a person who's standing to tell him he was not yet sure of, and she left the yard. The bay's whinny followed her through the gate. She counted it as a small and private victory, which was the only kind she was currently in a position to collect. That afternoon, she wrote to her father's solicitor in Colcroft, a man named Devers who had served the Westholts for 30 years and whose loyalty was to the name and not to whoever currently held it. She wrote to him on the household's own paper, which she was legally entitled to use, and she asked him for 3 things: the full original terms of the Westholt entailment, the name of every legal instrument that had touched the land in the past 5 years, and whatever he could locate regarding a man named Aldrich Pembrose. She sealed the letter herself, sent it with the afternoon post, and went to oversee the household linen inventory, because she was the mistress of this house, and linen did not catalog itself. The reply from Devers came in 4 days, which was fast enough that she knew he had thought it urgent once he understood what she was asking. She read it in the linen room, because the linen room had a lock and she had the key. What she read required her to sit down. She sat on a crate of pressed napkins and read it 3 times. There was a second set of documents. Not the transfer papers Pembrose had prepared, the ones she was meant to sign at the quarter session, the ones the Duke believed were standard entailment papers. A second set, a set that Devers had located through a junior clerk at the Colcroft registry, who had noticed that 2 instruments had been filed using the same reference number on different dates, which was not supposed to be possible. The first instrument was what the Duke believed existed, a simple transfer of the Westholt parcel into the Crestwall entail, unremarkable, clean. The second instrument, filed 3 weeks before the wedding, dated in Pembrose's hand but signed with a name that was not Pembrose's name, directed the Westholt parcel upon the execution of the transfer. Not into the entail, but into a private trust of which the sole beneficiary was a woman named Rosamund Vere. There was a margin note in a hand Devers did not recognize. It said, "Upon signature, the parcel is severed from entail. Duchess's standing in house terminates." which was a polite legal way of saying, sign and disappear. Maris put the letter in her pocket. She sat a moment longer, with her hands folded on her knee, very still, the way she went still when she was deciding something. The napkins pressed on either side of her smelled of cedar and lavender. Outside the window, a sparrow was harassing a stone finial with the single-minded determination of a creature that has decided the finial is an enemy and is prepared to fight it indefinitely. She watched the sparrow. Rosamund Vere. She had not known the name last week. She knew it now. The woman in the library, she was certain, though certainty in this case was a thing built of inference and the quality of a voice through a closed door, not enough for a tribunal, nowhere near enough. She needed more. She had 10 days. She also needed, she understood, to know what her husband actually knew, which was a different and considerably more delicate problem. She found the answer to the first part of that problem the following day, not by seeking it, but because she was in the East Corridor, for a legitimate reason. The East Corridor's window casements had been letting in rain. And she had been sent for by the housekeeper, a stoic woman named Mrs. Farden, who trusted no one but had begun to trust Maris in the tentative, assessing way of a person who has been let down often enough to need a great deal of evidence before committing. And she heard voices again. Not from a closed door, from an alcove around a turn in the passage, where 2 of the housemaids had not heard her coming. Says he barely speaks to her. Cold as February. This was the younger one. Maris placed her by her voice without needing to see her. Well, the older maid, Croft, who had been at Crestwall through the last Duke and the one before, and who held the moral authority of a woman who has outlasted everyone's worst behavior. He was the same after the first one died. Give him time. The first one? A pause. He was married before, 4 years ago. She died in childbed, the poor thing, and the child too. He shut down like a house in winter. The steward's been running everything since. The steward. Croft's voice dropped. Maris held herself motionless around the corner. Do you know, Sal? I found it odd. The papers he had her sign when she arrived said it was standard, new household authority, signature for the records. But Mrs. Farden never signed anything like that when she came, and she's been here 12 years. A long pause. Maris counted the beats of her own pulse. You didn't say anything? What was I to say? I'm a housemaid. Croft's voice was flat and dry and held a great deal beneath it, but I remember what she signed, witness enough to know it wasn't household authority. Maris walked back to her rooms. She sat at her desk and wrote, for the first time, in the household accounts, not in the ledger, in her own private memorandum book, which locked and which she kept on her person. She wrote the date, the names, what she had heard, what she knew, and what she needed. She wrote a list of witnesses. She counted the number she currently had and the number she needed, and the gap between them. Then she made a plan. The plan was not comfortable. The plan required her to speak to her husband, which she had been avoiding with the instinct of someone who has been trained by her own experience to avoid conversations in which she holds fewer cards than the other person. She did not yet hold enough cards. She thought she could remedy that, but the window was closing. She needed 2 things before she could have that conversation. She had one already, in her pocket. The second she would have to find. The talisman object she had been told in a letter from Devers's follow-up, the one that arrived on the 6th day, was a small enameled case. It had been her grandmother's, and by any right of the Westholt entailment it should have come to her with the parcel. Devers had noted its existence in the original inventory of the estate because it was listed as containing papers relevant to the land's early provenance, the original charter, the boundary survey, a copy of the letter's patent. Pembrose had catalogued it as part of the estate contents. It was not in the estate inventory he had presented her on her first day, which meant he had it, or he had given it to someone, and either way, it was not where it should be. She found it on the 8th day. She found it not because she had searched Pembrose's rooms. She had not. She would not. She did not have standing to, and more practically, she could not be caught looking, but because she had made herself useful in the way she was best at, which was being the kind of person who ends up alone in rooms sorting things, so invisibly competent that no one thinks to remove her. She had offered to help catalog the library's inventory, which was genuinely chaotic, and Mrs. Farden had been grateful, and Pembrose had glanced at her with his measuring look and then looked away, which told her that he had concluded she was unlikely to find anything there. The enameled case was not in the library. But while she was in the library, alone for 3 hours with full freedom of movement, she located the household ledger for the previous calendar year, the one Pembrose kept separately in the locked map cabinet, and she picked that lock with a hairpin she had been carrying for 6 days against this specific opportunity. The ledger contained what she had suspected. She could not take it. She memorized what she needed and relocked the cabinet and was cataloging the atlases when Pembrose returned with the afternoon tea. The enameled case she found on the 9th day in the office of the estate solicitor in the village, in a locked drawer that was not locked when she arrived, because the solicitor was a confused and somewhat frightened man named Wicks, who had prepared Pembrose's second instrument and was now, she suspected, very much regretting it. She had come to him on a pretext about the Martinmas contracts and watched him become confused when she mentioned the provenance of certain estate items. She had mentioned the enameled case by description only and watched his eyes go to the desk. That was enough. She left and came back the following morning with Mrs. Farden, who was owed a favor by the solicitor's wife and who collected it in the form of unsupervised access to the waiting room for 20 minutes. The case was in the top drawer of the solicitor's desk, which was now unlocked because Wicks had been called away by a message that Maris had written and sent the previous evening through the village post. Because the village post was also technically her household's to use, she did not feel entirely at peace with this. She did it anyway. Inside the case were the letters patent and the boundary survey and the original charter, and something Devers had not known to mention because it had been added afterward, folded between the charter and the lining, a single piece of paper in a hand she did not recognize, dated 2 years before her father's death. The paper was a record of a private promise, not a legal instrument, nothing that would hold in a court of law, but the kind of document a man writes when he wants a thing remembered, a statement, witnessed and signed, that the Westholt parcel was not to be alienated from the family bloodline under any circumstances, by any instrument, without the written consent of the current holder of the Westholt's name. The signature at the bottom was her father's. The witness's signature was the Duke of Crestwall's, her husband's father. She closed the case. She held it in both hands for a moment, the way you hold something whose weight you are still calculating, and then she put it in her pocket alongside the letter from Devers, and she went home. She spent the 9th night reading. Not the ledgers, not the memoranda, the household's copy of the Register of the County Quarter Sessions, which listed who sat as magistrate and who attended in official capacity and who was expected next fortnight. She made a list of names. She wrote letters she did not send yet. She went to bed at 2 a.m. and lay awake for approximately 20 minutes before deciding that lying awake was a form of cowardice she could not afford, and she slept. On the 10th morning, at breakfast, the first breakfast she had taken in the dining room rather than her own suite, because she needed him to see her, she looked across the table at her husband and said, "I should like to speak with you this evening, if you have time. There is a matter relating to the estate that I believe cannot wait past tomorrow." The Duke looked up from his correspondence. He had the quality, she had noticed, of a man whose attention, once given, was genuinely given, not the performance of attention that powerful men often substituted. He put down his letter. He looked at her as he had looked at her in the stable yard, and she held the look with more steadiness than she felt. "This evening," he said. "After dinner." "Thank you." She spent the day making preparations. She sent 3 letters that she had not sent the night before. She spoke to Mrs. Farden, and then, carefully, to the maid Croft, a conversation that required more delicacy than anything she had yet done, because Croft was principled and frightened and would only do what she believed was right, and Maris needed her to believe that what was right was also possible. It took an hour. When she left Croft's small room off the servants' hall, the maid was dry-eyed, and her jaw was set in the manner of a woman who has committed herself and intends to hold the commitment. Maris, in the corridor, allowed herself 3 seconds of her own private expression, which she did not show anyone, and then she put on the face she wore to difficult rooms and went to meet her husband's solicitor, who had been brought from Colcroft by her letter and was waiting in the library. He was a careful man, younger than Devers, with the look of someone who was very good at his work and knew it without being pompous about it. His name was Holt. She explained what she needed. She showed him what she had. She watched his face travel through several stages: confusion, professional skepticism, careful rereading, and then a particular quality of stillness she recognized as the stillness of a man taking in something that will require him to move very fast shortly. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He asked to retain certain documents. "After tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I will need them myself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're quite sure about this?" "I am always sure," she said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough for the present purpose. He agreed to return in the morning. She dressed for dinner with more care than she had taken in 11 days, which was not vanity. She did not operate from vanity, but an understanding that the clothes you wore to a negotiation were part of the negotiation. She wore gray silk, plain, good, the kind of dress that announced economy and refused apology. She wore her mother's pearl earrings, not because they were beautiful, but because they were the last things her mother had owned that were genuinely hers, and wearing them tonight felt appropriate in the way that carrying your history into the room always feels appropriate. She did not look at herself in the glass for more than 30 seconds. She took the enameled case and the letter from Devers and put them in the inside pocket of the evening's wrap, and she went downstairs. Dinner was quiet. It was always quiet. But the quality of the quiet had shifted from the indifferent silence of 2 strangers sharing a table to something with a different texture, the quality of a room that is waiting. She ate. She was practical about food, as about everything. She had been hungry before, and had found it interfered with thinking. He ate. He watched her, not rudely, in the focused way he had. He had dressed for dinner as well, which he had not always done. She noted it and did not flag it. After dinner, they went to the small sitting room rather than the library. Because she had chosen the small sitting room, it was hers to choose, technically, and she sat without being asked and folded her hands and looked at him. "I owe you an explanation before I give you information," she said. "I came to this marriage without illusions, and I intend to leave this conversation the same way. What I am about to tell you will be uncomfortable. I ask that you hear it fully before you respond." He had remained standing when she sat, which she thought was habit, the habit of a very tall man in a small room, and now he came to sit across from her, the movement deliberate and without haste. He said nothing. His hands were rested, open, on his knees, a man who was going to listen. She told him. She told him what she had overheard in the library, which she named first because she owed him the knowledge that she had overheard it. She watched his face for the library and kept her voice level, and was grateful that he kept his face composed, because composure, in this moment, was the only courtesy she could offer him. She told him what she had found in the ledgers. She told him what Devers had discovered, the second instrument, the duplicate reference number, the beneficiary. She told him the name Rosamund Vere and watched his face and catalogued what she found, not surprise. He knew the name. He knew it the way people know a name they have not spoken for a long time and which still costs something. The armor in his face did not change, but the quality behind it did, faintly, in the way of something that has been pressed on a tender place. She took out the letter from Devers and the enameled case and set them both on the table. She said the case was in Wicks's office in the village. I believe Pembrose gave it to him for safekeeping. Inside is your father's signature as witness to my father's express wish that this land not leave our bloodline without our written consent, which I had not, as of last night, given, and which I will not give to the document Pembrose prepared. She paused. Your father knew mine. He looked at the case. He looked at it the way people look at something they recognize from a place they thought was sealed. They were at school together, he said. He said it quietly, not for the information, but because it needed to be said. I know, she said, though she hadn't, quite, until this moment. I found the witness' signature and guessed. He reached out and touched the case, once with 2 fingers, and then brought his hand back. She watched that. I did not know about the second instrument, he said. I know. I would not have. He stopped. He began again, more precisely, because she had understood, a man who said what he meant when he was saying something important. I did not marry you with the intention that you should sign yourself out of your own name. I know, she said for the 3rd time. A silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. A silence of the kind that forms when 2 people are recalibrating the shape of the room they are in together. What do you need from me? He said. She had not expected that to be the question. She had expected anger at Pembrose, or at Vere, or at the situation, or perhaps at her for knowing things she had gone out of her way to find. She had not expected to be asked what she needed in the voice of a man who intended to provide it. She told him. Witnesses at the quarter session, the county magistrate, who was a man named Aldous Grieve and who owed the Crestwall name a degree of professional respect, Holt, her solicitor, already in the county. Mrs. Farden and Croft, whose testimony she would need to establish the irregularity of the papers Pembrose had had her sign on arrival. The ledger from the locked map cabinet, which she needed him to request formally so that it could be examined without the irregularity of a wife with a hairpin. Pembrose present, and Wicks, and if possible Rosamund Vere, because Vere was the beneficiary and her knowledge of the second instrument was the linchpin on which everything else turned. She said, I can go to the quarter session alone. You do not need to appear. I will appear. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct, unblinking attention, and she realized that she had, somewhere in the past 10 days, begun to see past the armor to what lay underneath it. Not coldness, but deliberateness, not indifference, but the terrible carefulness of a man who has been catastrophically wrong about something he loved and has committed himself, utterly, to never being wrong in the same way again. His flaw was deciding alone who might be spent to protect whom. She had seen the symptoms of it and had read them as indifference and had been wrong, which was information she accepted without ceremony because she did not have time for ceremony. It will be public, she said. That is rather the point, isn't it? She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Your father's signature is on the document in that case because my father trusted him." He said nothing. The fire moved. A coal settled. "I am trusting you," she said. "For the same reason, more or less." She did not know what she had expected him to say to that. She thought she might have expected the formal correct response, something measured and appropriate, and designed not to commit him to anything that might later be used against him. She was not prepared for what she got, which was nothing for a long moment, and then, "My father used to say that the Westholt women had better judgment than God." He said it quietly and without inflection, and then stood, because he was the kind of man who stood when something in him needed to move. I used to think it was flattery. I am revising the opinion. It was the most personal thing he had said to her since the wedding. She thought he knew it, and that it had cost him something, and that he had decided it was appropriate to spend it. She found that she approved. She stood as well. "Tomorrow morning, then, 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, he said. She took the enameled case and left him in the sitting room. She paused in the doorway because she had thought of something. She said, to the doorframe rather than to him, "There is one more thing I need that only you can give me. I need you to meet with Pembrose this evening, as though nothing has changed, and I need you to tell him that I have been making difficulties about the signing and that you believe it may be worth having Miss Vere speak to me directly tomorrow. At the house. Before the session." A long pause. She waited. "You want her where you can see her," he said. "I want her where we can all see her." Another pause. Then, "All right." She left him. She went to her room, and she sat with the enameled case on her desk, and her hands flat on the wood on either side of it, and she breathed, and she counted what she had. It was enough. It would have to be enough. She had put the dominoes in their positions. What she could not control was which one would fall first. She had a hinge, a crack, a place she believed would break under pressure. She had one question she intended to ask, and she believed it would work, and she was not entirely certain, and the uncertainty was the thing she sat with in the dark until she was ready to put it down. She slept 4 hours. She rose before 6. She dressed again with care, in blue this time, not gray, because today was not a day for refusing apology, but for something else, something she did not have an exact word for, except that it felt like standing in a door and refusing to be moved. She breakfasted alone and quickly. She prepared what she would need, setting each piece in its position, the letter from Devers, the second instrument in its copy, the enameled case, the memorandum she had written in her private book, transcribed neatly. She set them in order. She clasped the enameled case and put it in her pocket. Holt arrived at 7:30. The Duke came down at 7:45, dressed in the formal clothes he wore to county business, which she had not yet seen him in, and which had the curious effect of making him look both more imposing and, somehow, more legible, a man in his formal role. Wearing it without vanity, which was its own kind of character statement. He said good morning to her, and she said good morning to him, and they did not discuss the previous evening. Mrs. Farden arrived at 8 precisely, Croft behind her. Both women had dressed as though for something important, which they had, and Croft had the set jaw of a woman who has committed herself and intends to hold the commitment. Maris nodded to them and was grateful in a way she did not display. Magistrate Grieve arrived at 7:15, was shown in by a footman who was clearly uncertain about the nature of the proceedings, and accepted coffee with the dignity of a man who was accustomed to unusual mornings. He shook the Duke's hand and bowed to Maris and looked around the drawing room, where chairs had been arranged in a configuration that was not quite a sitting room and not quite a courtroom, but held something of both. His expression said that he understood what kind of morning this was and that he was prepared to perform his function. Pembrose came in at 8:30. He came, as she had intended, expecting a simple signing. The Duke had told him last evening that his wife had agreed to cooperate, that she needed only the formal transfer documents and a notary. He came with the documents under his arm, his beautiful suit, his quality of immaculate composure that she had learned in 11 days to read as a wall between himself and anything he feared. He came in and saw the magistrate, and saw Holt, and saw Mrs. Farden and Croft, and his composure, it did not break. It adjusted. The adjustment was visible only in the exact timing of his next breath. She was watching for it. Rosamond Vere came in 30 seconds after Pembrose, which told Maris she had been waiting in the carriage. She was, as Maris had expected from a voice through a closed door, beautiful in the manner of a woman who has made an art of beauty, with dark eyes and a quality of self-possession that matched Pembrose's for precision. She saw the room, and she saw what it held, and she made the same calculation Pembrose had just made, and her face arrived at the same composed adjustment, and the two of them met each other's eyes for a half-second, which was a half-second too long. Maris had positioned herself near the window. The morning light was coming in at an angle that put the room's occupants in better relief than they would otherwise have had. This was not accidental. The Duke stood near the fireplace, his face quiet, his hands rested. He was the kind of man, she had decided, who was most dangerous when most still, she said. "Thank you all for coming. I want to begin with a question." She looked at Wicks, who had arrived last, alone, and who had taken a chair at the edge of the room with the posture of a man who is very much hoping not to be noticed. He was slight and sweating and looked at his own hands when she looked at him. "Mr. Wicks," she said, "the document filed at the county registry on the 14th of January, the one using reference number 47-3, did you prepare it yourself, or were you given the text?" Wicks's head came up. He had not expected to be the first question. He looked at Pembrose. It was a very small look, a reflex, the kind that happens before the thinking catches up to the body. Everyone in the room had seen it. "Mr. Wicks," Magistrate Grieve said. His voice was not loud. "I think you understand the nature of this gathering." Wicks looked at his hands again. Then he looked at Maris, and she kept her face still and held his eyes with the steady, patient attention of a woman who has nowhere to be except this room, and something in the silence did what it needed to do. "I was given the text," he said. The sound Pembrose did not make was louder than anything he might have said. Maris took out the enameled case and set it on the table. She opened it in front of Magistrate Grieve and took out the document inside and placed it under the window, in the light, and she said, "This is my father's hand and signature, witnessed by the late Duke of Crestwall, expressing his explicit wish that the Westholt parcel not be alienated without the written consent of the current holder of the Westholt name. I have not given that consent. I was presented with a document that purported to require my signature for household authority, and which in fact contained a partial transfer provision." She looked at Croft, who straightened in her chair. "Mrs. Croft witnessed that signing." "I did," Croft said. Her voice was level and somewhat fierce. "The second instrument filed at the registry," Maris continued, "directs the parcel, upon execution, to a private trust with a single beneficiary." She looked at Holt, who produced the copy and handed it to Grieve. "The beneficiary is named in the document. I will not read it aloud, as it is not necessary. Magistrate Grieve has it before him. She did not look at Rosamond Vere. She would in a moment. Not yet. She looked at Pembrose. Pembrose was looking at the window, not at her, not at the document, at the window, in the manner of a man whose only resource left is to appear to be somewhere else. His hands were still. He was, she thought, deciding, she said, Mr. Pembrose, the ledger from the locked map cabinet, the one covering the period when the late Duchess was ill. She paused. Would you like me to tell the magistrate what it contains, or would you prefer to speak to it yourself? A long silence. Vere said, very quietly, Aldrich. It was a single word. The way she said it, not a warning, not a command, but a plea, very small and very precise, rearranged the room. Because it was the word of someone who was frightened, and fear worn by an immaculate person reads, on the ear, as grief. Maris had expected composure to the end. She had not quite expected this. She filed it, a private tell, a grief that had been inside the calculation all along, something that had started somewhere other than greed. Pembrose said nothing. His eyes came back from the window. They went to the Duke. The Duke of Crestwall had been silent through all of it. He was still silent. He was looking at Pembrose with the quietness of a man who has just been shown something he should have seen 4 years ago and who is deciding how to carry it. His face had not changed. His hands had not moved. But there was a quality in his stillness that Maris read as pain, clean and precise. And she thought, he trusted this man. He trusted him with everything. And the weight of that is what he is standing inside now. Pembrose looked at the Duke and something shifted in his face, the armor, dropping, not fully. A crack, the kind that shows when a man who has been performing a role for years is suddenly standing in the room without the audience the performance required. His jaw moved. He pressed it closed. The accounts from the period of Lady Crestwall's illness, Maris said, her voice was even, calibrated, carrying the precision of a woman making a record rather than an accusation, show a pattern of procurement entries consistent with repeated small additions to the household tea supplies purchased from a supplier whose name does not appear in any other record and who I have not been able to locate. I leave it to those with appropriate authority to investigate what was being procured and why. Grieve looked up from the document he was reading. The room did not move. Then Vere said, it was not, and stopped. Maris looked at her now. She held the look with the same stillness she used for everything important. Vere's face had gone from beautiful to human in the space of 20 seconds, which was the most honest thing about her that Maris had seen. Her hands, in her lap, were pressed together hard enough that the knuckles had gone pale. Miss Vere, Maris said, I have no intention of proceeding further with you than is necessary to protect what is mine and what was my father's. The question of other matters rests with the magistrate and not with me. A pause. You have been, I think, Maris said, the second thing in a system that was designed to place you first. I do not say that to be kind. I say it because it is true, and because it is the most important fact for whoever determines what comes next. She turned to Grieve. She said, I ask that the second instrument be formally voided on grounds of fraud, that the enameled case and its contents be registered as establishing the entailment condition, and that the Westholt parcel be confirmed to remain in my keeping under the terms of this marriage's original settlement. She paused. I do not ask for prosecution. I ask for correction. Grieve looked at her for a long moment. He was a careful man, not an unkind one, and he had the expression of someone who had been to many difficult mornings and understood this one for what it was. He said, the instrument will be voided. I will require the ledger. He looked at Pembrose. "You will surrender it." Pembrose said, very quietly, "Yes." He said it to the floor. It was not defiance, and it was not servility. It was the voice of a man who has finished something that had cost him more than he had thought it would, and who is not certain anymore whether the cost was what he intended to pay. Maris looked at him and found that she had done what she said she would do. She pitied him. Not absolved. Pitied, which was different and harder. She said, "There is a quarterly stipend associated with the Crestwall Estate's stewardship. I propose that it continue for 1 year, paid to Mr. Pembrose's account wherever he settles, on condition of his departure from the county and his cooperation in the matter of the registry. This is my proposal, and not his Grace's." She looked at the Duke briefly, a question, and he gave her, with a very small movement of his head, the answer she needed. "His Grace concurs." Pembrose looked up. He looked at her as though he was seeing her for the first time, which perhaps he was. His expression was the expression of a man being offered a door that is smaller than he deserves, and also more than he expected. His throat moved. "Yes," he said again. A different yes. She accepted it. Wicks was given a formal caution and dismissed. He left with the expression of a man who intends to practice a much more boring species of law for the rest of his career. Maris wished him well. Vere was asked by Grieve if she had legal representation, and said she did, and departed with the dignity of someone who is conserving everything they have left for a fight they have not yet decided whether to enter. Maris let her go. She had said what she meant. The rest was not hers to pursue. The room emptied gradually, until it held only Maris, the Duke, Holt, and Mrs. Farden, and then Holt departed with Grieve to complete the paperwork, and Mrs. Farden looked at the two of them and said, in the voice she used when she had something to say, and had decided to say it, "I'll have tea sent. Shall I?" and left before either of them answered. Maris sat down. She had not realized until she sat how thoroughly she had been standing, in every sense. She set the enameled case on the table in front of her and looked at it. The Duke had moved from the fireplace. He came and sat, not across from her as he had last night, but in the chair beside her, a different geometry, less formal. The chair that people sit in when they are not performing a position. He did not speak immediately. She was grateful for that. She said, after a moment, "Your father's signature was there, because my father asked him to witness it. Not because of the entail. Because they were friends. My father trusted very few people." She said it because it needed to be said, and because she understood that he needed to hear what the paper meant, not just what it did. "I know," he said. And then, because he was a man who said what he meant when it cost him, I should have looked more closely at Pembrose. Years ago, I knew he resented the first marriage. I told myself it was grief. He had known her longer than I had. A pause. He blamed me. For things that were not another pause. He blamed me, and it seemed to him, I think, a kind of justice. She looked at her hands. And Miss Vere? She was there before I was, in the household, a companion to my mother. And then she stayed. He stopped. He began again. She hoped, perhaps, or he hoped for her. It amounts to the same thing. It did amount to the same thing, she thought. A long compound grief turned sideways into a plan, because grief without outlet will find one. She said, "I'm sorry about your wife." A silence. She had not planned to say it. She said it because it was true, and because the occasion was one that required truth rather than strategy. "Thank you," he said. His voice was level, and beneath it was the place the grief lived, which he kept carefully, and which she did not press. The tea arrived, carried by a footman who placed it with commendable precision and left with the commendable speed of someone who has read the room correctly. She poured. She handed him a cup. He took it, and there was a moment, an ordinary, specific, domestic moment, her hand and his hand in a cup of tea in a drawing room where they had just unraveled a plot and were sitting in the aftermath together, that had a quality she could not name except that it felt like something beginning. He said, "You said you trusted me. I did. For the same reason as your father, more or less." He held the cup in his weathered hands, and she could see him turning the phrase over. What does the more or less contain? She considered. My father trusted your father because they had been boys together and survived the same things. I trusted you because you asked what I needed, and I believed you meant to provide it. She paused. That is not the same reason at all, is it? No, but it is a better one, she said. He looked at her. The firelight had shifted as the morning came further in, and the room was full of ordinary daylight now, which was, she thought, exactly right, not the drama of candles or storm, just the plain working light of a morning that intended to go on being a day. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he was going to look at for a long time. I would like, he said carefully, to begin again, if that is a thing you would consider. What would beginning again look like? Breakfast, he said, taken in the same room. The accounts reviewed together. The stable yard, without apology for your opinions. He paused. I am told I do not speak enough. You could correct me when I err. She felt the thing she had been not feeling for 11 days, which was something like humor, and something like warmth, and something like the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a great deal alone and has been offered, carefully and without obligation, a hand. That is an extraordinary amount of latitude, she said. I have been given reason to believe it is warranted. Have you? More or less, he said, and the corner of his mouth, the right corner, the one that moved when he was amused and had decided to let it show, moved very slightly. It was the first time she had seen it. It was, in every sense that mattered, a pivot, she said. Then yes, I would consider it. She did not say, on one condition, or provided that, or any of the guarded clauses she had been accumulating for the past 11 days. She said yes without a qualifier, because the condition she would have named was that she be choosing freely, and the freedom was already present in the choice. He understood this. She could see that he understood it by the quality of the silence that followed, which was not the silence of things not said, but of things that had been said completely. He handed her the butter for the scones. She took it. They had breakfast in the drawing room, with the morning coming in through the windows and the enameled case sitting open on the table between them, the papers inside catching the light, and outside a sparrow that was still, or perhaps again, engaged in its campaign against the stone finials. She heard it first. He watched her hear it, and she said, There is a sparrow conducting a territorial dispute with the east parapet, and he said, There usually is. I believe it to be the same sparrow for 3 years. He is losing consistently, but refuses to accept this as definitive, and she said, Then he has more in common with the parapet's previous inhabitants than one might expect. And he looked at her, and then he laughed. A real laugh, quiet and sudden. The laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh, and did not mind finding himself wrong. And she stored it like the first solid piece of evidence in a long investigation, and went on drinking her tea. There were forms to sign with Holt that afternoon, legitimate ones, forms that transferred nothing she did not intend to transfer, that confirmed what the morning had established. She signed them with her full name. She had been, for 11 days, uncertain which name to use. She used both now, the Westholt and the Crestwall, side by side, because they were both true and she saw no reason to choose. The quarter session was held 2 days later as scheduled. Grieve presented the voiding of the second instrument. The Westholt parcel was formally confirmed in the settlement. Pembrose had already left the county. His stipend would follow him, for a year as promised, to wherever he went. Maris did not wish him ill. She found that she did not need to. She had, at the session, looked once at the chair he would have occupied, and thought, a long grief, turned sideways, turns back eventually. I hope he finds somewhere to put it. She did not know if he would. She let the thought go. Wicks had resigned his post and removed to a smaller town north of the county, where he set up a practice dealing exclusively in property surveys and farm contracts, which are boring and difficult to misuse. He was, by all accounts, very good at them. Croft was given a senior position in the household, not as reward, but as correction. She had been in the rank she occupied, not because of her competence, but because she had not been a man. This was addressed. She was, at the small celebration Mrs. Farden hosted in the servants' hall the following week, observed to weep for approximately 90 seconds and then recover fully and inform everyone present that she was not weeping and that the matter was closed. Rosamond Vere left the county quietly and did not return. She took up residence in the south, near her own family, and was said by the time the next year's gossip made its circuits to have become involved in establishing a school for working women, which required a great deal of negotiation and a strong stomach for obstruction, and at which she was understood to be formidably effective. Maris heard this secondhand, and thought, there it is, the place she found to put it. She was glad she had meant what she said. The grief was real even when the plan was wrong, and a real grief, properly directed, can build rather than dissolve. She did not write to her. She thought about it once, and then let it settle into the category of things that do not need saying. Holt became, by a natural evolution of circumstance and trust, the estate's principal legal counsel. He and Maris developed, over the course of the first year, a professional relationship of considerable precision and mutual respect, which expressed itself primarily in the form of very efficient letters. Devers, in Colcroft, received a formal expression of thanks and a new commission, and sent back a note in his 60-year-old hand that said only, "Your father would be glad," which was the most useful thing anyone said to her that month. The Duke's bay gelding, reshod to 1/4 of an inch more generous at the coronet, recovered his gait completely in 3 weeks. He became, over the course of the summer, Maris's preferred horse because he was sensible and did not startle, and had the admirable quality of going where he was asked, without requiring commentary on the subject. Pell, the groom, came to terms with her opinions on equine welfare by the mechanism of being proved right about them several times in succession, after which he extended the particular loyalty that competent grooms extend to people who are right about horses, which is a deeper loyalty than most. The wedding, the quiet one, the real one, the small ceremony performed in the parish church rather than the county cathedral where the settlement had been signed, was attended by Mrs. Farden and Croft and Pell and Holt, and because she had been writing to him since childhood, and he had made the journey from Colcroft by the early mail, Devers wept, openly, without apparent embarrassment, and when asked about it later, said only that he was thinking about the weather. The Duke of Crestwall looked at the woman beside him through the whole of the service, and she looked ahead, and they exchanged no vows that were not the ones required, and no promises that were not the ones they intended to keep, and it was, by every measure that mattered, enough. It was almost a year from the morning in the library when she overheard him. Late spring. the hills above the park running green and the chalk downland of the West Holt parcel showing white at its edges, where the turf was thinner and she had sent the surveyors to map it properly because no one had done so in 30 years. When she came in from the stable yard to find him in the library, sitting at the table where she now kept her household accounts in open view, reading a letter she did not recognize. He looked up when she came in. She was dusty. She did not apologize for this. "What is it?" she said. He held the letter out. "From Pembrose." She took it and read it standing, still in her riding coat. It was not long. It was the letter of a man who was not asking forgiveness, but acknowledging a debt, which was different and more honest. It named what he had done and what it had cost and expressed, without flourish, that he understood the cost. It was signed with his name and a date and nothing else. She read it twice. She set it down on the table. "What will you do with it?" she said. "Keep it," he said. "I think it deserves to be kept." She looked at the letter, and then at him, and then at the window where the afternoon light was coming in at the same angle it had come in on the morning of the hearing, falling across the table and catching the edge of the enameled case, which lived now in the library on the shelf below the atlases, in the space where the ledger used to be. She had put it there deliberately. She liked knowing where it was. "He wrote it to both of us," she said, "not just to you." Yes, she thought about what that meant. The acknowledgement not just of the wrong done to the Duke, but of the wrong done to her. Specifically, the wrong done to a woman who had been intended to sign herself out of her own name without knowing it. She thought about a long compound grief, turned sideways. She thought about directions. "Yes," she said. "Keep it." She went to the window. Outside, the park was running on into the early summer with the unhurried green of a season that had been coming a long time and intended to stay. The sparrow, she had decided it was the same sparrow, because she had decided to give him credit, was perched on the parapet with the posture of a creature that has negotiated a temporary arrangement with his enemies and is using the break to survey his territory. "I have the Martinmas projections for the home farm," she said. "When you have a moment." "I have a moment now." She crossed the room and set the papers on the table beside the letter from Pembrose and sat down, in her riding coat, dusty from the chalk downland that was hers and had always been hers and now was also his, and he moved the letter to make room for the accounts. And the afternoon went on around them, ordinary and specific and warm. She did not look up from the projections when she said, "You said," in the library that first evening, before you knew I had been there, that once the transfer was executed, I might go wherever I liked. She kept her voice even. I wanted on record that I find the terms considerably less attractive than the alternative. He looked at her across the papers. His mouth was doing the thing with the right corner. "Noted," he said. "The record is kept." "Good," she marked a figure in the margin. "You are welcome. If warmth left you here, in a story where the woman who was never supposed to matter proved otherwise, where what looked like a cold arrangement turned out to be something that needed only the right person to look clearly at it, then know there is always a chair waiting. The fire has been burning a long time, and we keep it lit for exactly this kind of evening. If you found yourself caught at the moment she opened that door, or at the first time he laughed, or at the letter read in the linen room with no witness but a sparrow and a locked key, leave it in the comments. Tell me what you would have done had you been the one who overheard him. And if you'd like to spend more evenings like this one, a quiet subscription keeps your place by the fire. There are more stories where this came from. More overlooked women, more armored men, more rooms full of truth waiting for the right person to hold it up to the light. Sleep gently and be a keeper of honest accounts.